So Ice Entertainment, Sun Valley what it do, Tisco what it do, Golden Core what it do, stand up, I see y'all. J's in my burglar ball, 10, 20, 50, 100, baby, do my burglar ball. House with the pull around, ready for the trap ball. Get it, gone, house full of trap store. Burglar ball, J's in my burglar ball, 10, 20, 50, 100, baby, do my burglar ball. House with the pull around, ready for the trap ball. Get it, gone, house full of trap store.
The man inside the RV is the murder suspect, accused of shooting two men in the Golden Gate Park Panhandle earlier in the day, including a 28-year-old man who died from his wounds.
like this. Biatch.
Follow your passion first. When I retired from the game, I sat there asking kind of all the wrong questions. What's the biggest industry I can get into? And it's all the wrong stuff. And you got to sit there and ask yourself, okay, what am I truly passionate about? What do I enjoy doing? And when you feel that way, honestly, you feel like you've never worked a day in your life. It's the most fun thing in the world. You get up in the morning excited about what you're doing. And you got to be really honest with yourself about it. If you wake up in the morning and you're dreading going to work, dude, do something else. Do something else. And those are...
Solid, I get big deposits on my website, exotic.
5:30, a brazen jewelry store robbery at a South Florida mall, and the store's owner fights back. It appears the thieves knew exactly what they were going for, and they knew how to work fast.
The whole thing taking less than 1 minute, and one suspect has already been caught. CBS 4's Ted Scouten live at the Coral Ridge Mall in Fort Lauderdale with a closer look at what happened. Ted.
can't trust nobody, I mean nobody. And I can't love no bitch off about his money. Hell yeah, he don't play that. My son went to school today in the back of the Maybach. I don't pass my blunts, I roll one up, then I'ma face that. Hit him where it hurt and smash his bitch and tell him take that. Come through in a different foreign every time, I know they hate that. You love saving these hoes, don't you pussy? Where your cape at? Yeah, hold up.
Attention stoners, attention stoners.
Floating off that kush cloud, floating off that kush cloud, floating off that kush cloud, that kush cloud, that kush cloud, my kush cloud, my kush cloud, floating off that kush cloud, floating off that kush cloud, OG turned up too loud, that floating off that kush cloud, floating off that kush cloud, floating off that kush cloud, that kush cloud, that kush cloud, my kush cloud, my kush cloud, floating off that kush cloud, floating off that kush cloud, OG turned up too loud. Oh murder, yeah, time on my murder, yeah. Tell her that I just gotta shit me in, and if you win, and I serve you, yeah. Floating off of that kush cloud, OG turned up too loud. A nigga busy getting to the money, your weed is live, and your head nigga get tuned out. Nah, they don't want that shit. Check it the powder, how you want that with? Find it out, pound it out. Took it to the house, I ain't want that bitch. I get the killer shit from my niggas in the bay. Within the dinner, so what you niggas wanna pay? Yeah, up in the attic, I'm in the ceiling with the day. Up in the building, you pussy niggas in the way. Get thug, my niggas don't be smoking good. Roll my dope for good, so yeah, I bust some good. Corporate thuggin', the wall I'm with is good, nigga. Get the picture, this rapper stand good. Floating off that kush cloud, floating off that kush cloud, floating off that kush cloud, that kush cloud, that kush cloud, my kush cloud, my kush cloud, floating off that kush cloud, floating off that kush cloud, OG turned up. Back then I was never gon' smoke no more. 20 minutes late, ain't gonna smoke one more. The next thing you know, I'm blowing through the whole house. Smoke alarm going off, someone leaving on my door. I'm real low, keep stoner, really stoner, real be stoner. Wanna kick it with me, you better bring weed over. I got too many problems, ain't no need to be sober. But I ain't really waiting on you niggas to split roll in hit it, cause I'm already got me some. On another nigga, I'm on it, yeah. Great that cap, I'm on it, though. I hit a little bit of Snoop boutique clutch, and I roll up some Wiz Khalifa, nigga, the hook. This sticky icky nigga just too deep, cause I'm trying to get it moving on Cypress, yeah. Bust on that, bust on that, on that. Don't ask if I'm high. Look into my eyes, you can tell that I'm zoning. Career for the kids, bigger than this. Big Chris, get ready when I come and rock a cone that in my spaceship. And we take off in the floating off that kush cloud, floating off that kush cloud, floating off that kush cloud, that kush cloud, that kush cloud, my kush cloud, my kush cloud, floating off that kush cloud, floating off that kush cloud, OG turned up too loud, that kush cloud, that kush cloud, floating off that kush cloud, that kush cloud, that kush cloud, floating off that kush cloud, my kush cloud, my kush cloud, floating off that kush cloud, floating off that kush cloud, OG turned up too loud.
Well, we at the last motherfucking song. So light up a Fat Mac J or a Mac Blunt and let's get it on.
How you gonna cancel me? 20 awards to the mantelpiece. Pyramid stage at Glastonbury. Girls in the crowd with their hands me. 20 awards to the mantelpiece. Pyramid stage at Glastonbury. Girls in the crowd with their hands on me. About you wanna cancel boo. Fuck with the cult with the gangs on you. I'm a vampire with the fangs on you. Now you're tripping blood. How you gonna cancel me? 20 awards to the mantelpiece. Pyramid stage at Glastonbury. Girls in the crowd with their hands on me. About you wanna cancel boo. Fuck with the cult with the gangs on you. I'm a vampire with the fangs on you. Now you're tripping blood.
Hi folks, I'm Alan Watt and this is Cutting Through the Matrix on the 11th of June 2017. Did you ever come into real consciousness once in a blue moon? And then it suddenly hits you that years have gone by and articles that you read years ago, which you said, well, this couldn't happen or this is impossible to happen, have all happened. Social changes mandated by law, put forth by big foundations which you don't elect, but so many people work for. And when you look at all the things that have been changed in the culture and everything, basically, you wonder where you've been. Even when you've been covering all of these changes along the way, there's so many, you end up in this blurry sense of time, in a sense. Because so many changes really are piled upon you. And it reminded me, and this is some of the things I was looking at this week, it reminded me of this big question of why do you accept the big changes? And part of it is, of course, that you're starting to be beaten down in a sense, psychologically, without being stressed out over it generally, but beaten down into accepting it. And as you're accepting it, you're whacked with something else. And so what you're accepting becomes of lesser importance in a way. And that's the technique that basically in psychopolitics they use upon the general populations and the masses. It reminded me of many of the articles and books put out by H.G. Wells and the Fabian socialists in Britain, where he talks about a kind of party held by Lady Astor. Now, the Astors were rich tycoons that came over from the States to London and very quickly were made, Lord Astor was made, well, he's made a lord, and his wife was made, I don't know, a duchess or a lady or whoever it happens to be. And they were one of the big funders of the Fabian movement for a controlled, ordered society, using the techniques to get the working people in first and seeming to be on their side to an extent. But really, the true left wing is all about scientists and experts running everybody else's lives. That's what it's really all about. And that's why the big bankers at the top love it, and governments at the same time too, because the more predictable they can make the future always appear to be by manipulating everybody to make it so, then the safer they feel. But they do have this big long-term agenda. I understand that free will and having people with the belief that they have natural rights because they're born into a world where every creature that is alive has natural rights. We give natural rights through the Biodiversity Treaty of Maurice Strong to every animal on the planet except humans. In fact, I think at the meeting, one of the meetings he had, Maurice Strong, he was asked by a man about human rights. Well, what about human rights? All I've heard today is the rights for animals and trees and so on. And Maurice Strong said to him, by the time we're finished, he said, you'll wish you had the rights of a tree. Because man was to be the enemy. But what I'm saying here is we are managed carefully, step by step, in a Fabian style, into accepting different planned events and changes over certain periods of time, with 5-year plans for some, 2-year plans for others, 50-year plans for others, and 100-year plans for some too. And Wells, H.G. Wells, the party of Lady Astor, was talking to her about this, and she says, we can't fail. Our agenda and her plan for the future can't fail. She didn't mean if anything went wrong, oh goodness me, it can't fail, surely. No, she was literally saying it can't fail. Because they were so confident at the early 20th century. They were so confident that they understood society so well by studying them. They understood the new sciences that are all coming into play. They'd existed before under different names, but in the 20th century we had all the different new names for these sciences. And they were becoming more and more comprehensive because they were using tax money to study us all. And it's escalated up to the present time. Every country does it. And they know how to bring a whole country or nation or block of countries from this point on any particular topic or subject or stance to complete opposite one within a span of a few years or whatever. They know how to do this. They also have other diversionary tactics too, to throw into the mix, to throw people off balance so that they lose track of all these very important things. And they never really get back on track again to remember what they actually were. By the time they remember, new laws have come in, and through the massive media propaganda, which is incessant, by the way, through everything that you read or get entertained by, all these things are inserted into them. And people who watch television are goners, really. I have to say this, because there's nothing you'll watch on television that's not highly propagandized with a whole stack of agendas that make you eventually, and children growing up watching all this stuff, have particular opinions on various topics, which are often completely opposed to the ones that their parents or grandparents had. That's not by chance, that's by design. And when you get it so intermixed with comedies and movies and dramas, and all these little bits and bytes of information and propaganda, it's well designed by professionals to really get into the mind and take a foothold and influence the person. Because when you mix, especially in fiction, when you mix particular incredible scenes, dramatic scenes, with all of the emotions involved, that tends to imprint itself. And children are very easily imprinted. And once they're imprinted with a clear-cut forest back in the 1940s, which they keep showing, then they'll literally be on board with the whole agenda, completely unaware that the masters have been tampering with their minds for another agenda down the road, which they're not even aware of yet. It's fantastic to watch this, really, and study it, and to see it and remember it too. Because we're constantly hit with all the changes. Hit, over and over and over and over again. What I try to do every so often is to bring myself up short and think back to articles and books I've read years ago. Some on the air, some of them, and bits and pieces of them on the air too. And I always think of Jacques Ellul, who was a great philosopher, very obsessional in a sense, like they're supposed to be. He's a real, true philosopher. He could take a particular topic and hammer it to death, even line by line, until you'd almost fall asleep, unless you could manage to hang in there. And Hillel, again, had a tremendous insight through all these studies of human nature and the workings of big policies at the top on general populations and different segments too within the populations, because everyone's catered to, and they're all often given sides. Each one's person's given a side to join in something. That's not by chance. The people who join them always think they're coming to join them by their own conclusions and their own reason, basically, but it's not necessarily true at all. But what he said was propaganda must also furnish an explanation for all happenings, a key to understanding the whys and the reasons for economic and political development. News loses its frightening character when it offers information for which the listener already has a ready explanation in his mind, or for which he can easily find one. The great force of propaganda lies in giving modern man all-embracing, simple explanations and massive doctrinal causes without which he could not live with the news. And that was Jacques Ellul from Propaganda, the Formation of Men's Attitudes. You've got to understand, we're given simplistic answers and reasons for everything. Whenever you get simplistic answers, you're being lied to. Tremendously. I've given many talks before about propaganda, from all the way from even before Bernays, in the Bernays period too, in his particular book on propaganda. It's ongoing all the time. For all aspects of governing the people, it's propaganda. But the word is never used by those who are trying to convince you of something, or are trying to manipulate you into following something or doing something or whatever it happens to be. But the technique they use in psychopolitics and so on is to use propaganda with the techniques of having you obey, often almost subliminal suggestions as to why you should go along with something and do something. These are incredibly well used today with the green system and give up your rights and give up everything to save the earth, etc. All this stuff I talked about years ago. Again, the slap in the face thing that you get once in a while when you say, whoa. Stuff I talked about years ago and gave talks on has all happened. Right, all the way from Gorbachev talking about the creation of a new religion, an earth worship, a form of earth worship, he said. And it's all happened. The children have all been trained in school to a form of earth worship under the guise of different names: sustainability, the green agenda, the cutting back on CO2, global warming, and then they scratched that and called it climate change, and so on and so on. Agenda 21, it's all part of it. It's all happening. And right now, there's pretty well no real opposition to it. And for most folk who follow it, your armies and armies of people, many of whom are just ordinary people who get all the little bits and bytes of information from television. But if you get lots of bits and bytes that sink into your mind over a few years, repetition, said Bertrand Russell, it becomes your opinion. And you haven't even reasoned it out or thought it out. It's quite easy to do. So anyway, again, propaganda must also furnish an explanation for all happenings. That's why when they have a bank crash, oh, they got a bank crash, oh, simple propaganda, eh? Oh, they just overdid the mortgages and so on, and resold them and just kept inflating the prices, etc., etc., etc. Very simple. Yeah. The key to understanding the whys and reasons for economic and political developments. News loses its frightening character when it offers information for which the listener already has a ready explanation in his mind, or for which you can easily find one. Generally, you have one in your mind from bits and bytes from, again, the sources that television, talking heads, or even radio, doesn't matter. And the force of propaganda lies in giving modern man all-embracing simple explanations and massive doctrinal causes. Simple explanations. Oh, the Earth's going to die. Oh, it's unsustainable. We're going to cut back the population. Oh, we're going to bring into austerity. You're using too many resources. Massive doctrinal causes, without which he could not live with the news that the Earth's all going to die. Quite easy, isn't it? And that's from, let's say, the formation of men's attitudes from propaganda. And then it says modern propaganda reaches individuals enclosed in the mass and as participants in that mass. Yet it also aims at a crowd, but only as a body composed of individuals. What does this mean? First of all, that the individual never is considered an individual, but always in terms of what he has in common with others, such as his motivations, his writings, or his myths. That's from the same book, Propaganda. The formation of men's attitudes. But think of that again. All marketers know this, those in marketing and strategies. Like Bernays, he knew all this stuff too. It's much easier to just cut up society into different groups for like different things are involved in certain things, and they become a group. And there's many kinds of groups. So what you do is you just take the numbers of the individuals in the group, and that's your target. They've got something in common. Take it over, because it's already established, by using the language of the group and elaborating on it too. And then what you do then is you start bending the group to your will and for what you want to use them for. So he said here, first of all, that the individual never is considered an individual, but always in terms of what he has in common with others, such as his motivations, his writings, or his myths. Propaganda tends to make the individual live in a separate world. He must not have outside points of reference. He must not be allowed a moment of meditation or reflection. Instead, successful propaganda will occupy every moment of the individual's life, through posters and loudspeakers, when he is out walking, through radio and newspapers at home, through meetings and movies in the evening. And that was the part of propaganda, the formation of men's attitudes, again. And that's how propaganda works. That's why you can walk, if you walk somewhere, if it's safe to walk anywhere, in different places it's not. But anyway, if you walk along, say, into a park or some place where folks sit and feed the ducks or whatever, and most people take it for granted that if they stay on general topics that are current, and they'll even pick these topics with thinking that everyone else will know these particular topics. They don't think about it in any depth. They just know that if they say, well, oh dear, the world's unsustainable, and if you say that to someone at 18, maybe 20, they're going to understand what you mean. Oh yeah, we got to blah, 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 you see. That's how it's done. Or you can take something more benign even, and just say, my goodness, the prices are going up because the dollar's dropping, and its purchasing power. Oh yeah. This is stuff that's current, always current. But at the same time, if you got something back, an answer, you'd probably be floored. That's how most folks are. If you mention anything in any depth at all, you floor them to an extent. If they say, oh, the dollar's dropped, yeah, and you go into a real reason as to why it is happening. And if you lose track of the fact this person has no clue and has never studied even where money comes from, never mind who manages it at the top, or what it even really is, except you can buy things with it. But if you go into any depth, you'll see them glaze over, and because when they said, oh, the dollar's dropping, they didn't expect an educational talk or lecture coming back at them. That's why it's not really wise to do these things anymore. And I really mean that, because people's attention span has been plummeting for quite a while, intentionally too. They'll think of the big things they're hearing all the time. Oh my goodness, we've got wars on the go, and this, and that, and the other thing, and oh, there's terrorism everywhere. And because of that, their minds, and you're talking about collectively too, many groups, even one big group of a nation, you might say, are concerned with these things, because that's what they're told to be concerned about. But the reasons for them, the true reasons, are never given in the first place. After all, if governments truly wanted to stop terrorism, the answers as to how to do it are all in front of them. They know this. Terrorism is obviously a useful tool. Back in the 90s and through the 2000s at the beginning, there was a lot of movies came out about dystopic futures. And they all had the same kind of, it's either zombies or also it was just through disasters and some kind of wars, and there's people going about the rubble and they're dazed and hungry and all the rest of it. And it was so common that I had to say, this is not by accident we're seeing all this kind of stuff. Even the children of men, all that kind of thing. It's all repetition of the same kind of thing. And if you watch these things and you're not being careful, you're being downloaded with points of view, which now are coming into play. You've already got the points of view downloaded into you, not just with one thing, but many movies, dramas, and so on. And again, bits and bytes of propaganda from documentaries or news clips, whatever it happens to be. They're not there by accident. Remember that all news sources are there to manage you. They're not there to say, oh, let's tell the people what's going on. That's the last thing that governments would want to happen. And forget governments for a minute too. What about those who own the governments, which is not the people? I've gone through so many talks in the past about the Royal Institute for International Affairs, Carroll Quigley, the Tragedy and Hope, the Anglo-American Establishment, and many, many others, ones even before him, like Zimmerman, who looked after the records of the Council on Foreign Relations, Royal Institute for International Affairs. They have their own private records of history as to how history really happened and for the real reasons that history happened. And always patting themselves on the back as being the prime players for directing it all, right to the present day. Private organizers, you don't vote them in, but every major mogul of news and newspapers and television news, big chains, all belong to the Council on Foreign Relations, the Round Table Societies, as Quigley also called them. So it's all the same group. And they've made it quite plain over many, many years, and in their own writings, that their whole goal is world government and managing the people completely. They don't believe in you having your own point of view, your own mind, and you'll never get it as long as you only give access to what they're going to tell you. For instance, just a little quip, a little aside here. All this nonsense about Qatar being suddenly targeted by Saudi Arabia and other countries. Why do you think that's really happening? I read, when I was on the air, I read to the people from, again, mainstream newspapers that seem to all... It's amazing how they all seem to forget the same characters in the same papers. Eh? But anyway, they released all the documentation a few years back that the US and Britain and all, again, the Western allies, were funding, through Qatar, the money and equipment and the arms for the training of the groups that were meant to take out Syria and the other countries that have gone now too. And I read in there too that the Council on Foreign Relations own magazine, when they talked about it too, Foreign Affairs magazine, the article where they said that perhaps ISIS is their best ally in taking out Syria. Think about that. How come most folk have forgotten all that? Because now you're in this limbo land where you can't make heads or tails of who is who anymore. It's all the same players. The funding's all from the same sources. But it does remind me too of George Orwell's 1984, where you're fighting East Asia today and some other place tomorrow. But it's never mentioned that you've changed your gun sights from one country to the next. That's how it's done. You understand, we slip into these massive movements, and most folk don't become indignant about it because they're not really conscious of it all. And again, in psychopolitics, etc., and the neuroscientists know this too, most folk go through their day in and out of a form of self-hypnosis. They really do. Obviously, we can't go through every day thinking about the stuff I'm talking about, like 24 hours a day. You go mad. But regardless, most people really are in and out of it. And again, like Bertrand Russell said, in the future, they could train the public. Train them. Because remember, this amorphous thing called democracy was to be trained out of the people, even when they were taught to believe in it. Double thinking. But be trained out of them because they gradually be conditioned and trained that those in charge and all these authorities and voices you hear with authority are somehow special, and they're there managing things in almost a superhuman fashion of pure integrity and honesty. And that's how simple the technique is. Most folk today, there's a lot of people in countries across Europe and so on, they don't bother voting anymore. And it's true enough, voting is a great con. But most folk don't vote, not because they don't believe in one or the other. It's because they're almost at a childish stage where they've been trained to believe you just leave things to the experts. Like these people that get into power are experts, really. They've been trained to believe that. And many, many sciences went into working on everyone's mind to make them think that. Now getting back to Jacques Ellul. And these things are so important to remember every other day, in fact, sometimes, so you don't trip up and forget what's going on. And by going on, I don't mean the events that are presented to you, true or false, but to decipher what is, perhaps to an extent, true or false. Give you a better chance to understand or discern. Now, Jacques Ellul also talked about something that, again, Russell and many others I've quoted over the years have talked about, going way back, even in the late 1800s, right up to the present time. And those in the know who are taught certain courses when they're allowed into the managerial side of human nature, and they are believe me, they're out there. What happens is you must lay a groundwork in every child. Now, a lot of the Marxist writings, even pre-Marxist, had this in it. Even going back to Voltaire, you can find this idea of education. And had the encyclopedists at the time, when they said that we will put out all the information, people will believe it because they're given no other side of any story. But when you get children and you put them into school, what child? See, natural children shouldn't have any need to be paranoid about anything. The natural, if you're a real nice society, we're all nice. Let's say we're all nice, right? And you would have children, like a little tribe, who would know instinctively, intuitively, that those in charge, the elders in that small tribe, were all looking out for them and would help them and try to prevent them from hurting themselves or whatever. That's trust. You just take that from a little tribe where that would work awfully well. a natural way, to the chronology of today, where whole sciences and batteries of scientists work on our minds constantly for big think tanks, for every part of education, and even planning what those down the road in 50 years will be made to believe has all been written already. And they know how to bring it about step by step, so they will believe this or whatever it happens to be. Because education is basically this. This is a related point. Propaganda cannot work without education, even primary education. So education is not necessarily a defense against anything. The natural mind would be, you would be a bit suspicious. Oh, wait a minute, what does this mean? If it's a natural mind. But he says, education, or what usually goes with the word in the modern world, is the absolute prerequisite for propaganda. It sets the foundations for further propaganda down the road to work on the individual. It's like setting up a base. It's almost like putting a computer program in, you might say. And so certain little algorithms go through it, they'll immediately go into a certain pose of accepting and believing they understand. So you must get this into there really quickly. And he also talks about vast amounts of incoherent information already dispensed for ulterior purposes and posing as facts and as education. To make the organization of propaganda possible, the media must be concentrated. Back to the CFR, Royal Institute for International Affairs. The number of news agencies reduced. They just make sure that they put everybody else out of business. The press brought under single control and radio and film monopolies established. The effect will still be greater if the various media are concentrated in the same hands. And again, that's Jacques Ellul, the propaganda formation of men's attitudes. Again, to make the organization of propaganda possible, the media must be concentrated, the number of news agencies reduced, and the press brought under single control. That's all been done long ago. In the British Commonwealth countries, they have national television and radio station. The BBC in Britain, and you have CBC in Canada, and you have the Australian Broadcasting Corporation, and things like that. And these are all the voices of authority. And it's quite interesting even studying them, becoming matriarchal and talking to the people as though they're little children, and you're naughty children with these voices of authority. It's interesting to watch. But remember, these are just voices that are there to continue your education in obedience to the propaganda that they're putting across for behavioral change in society. That's quite amazing. Also, you find Ellul saying Stalinist propaganda was in great measure founded on Pavlov's theory of the conditioned reflex. Hitlerian propaganda was in great measure founded on Freud's theory of repression and libido. American propaganda is founded in great measure on John Dewey's theory of teaching. That's from the same propaganda, the formation of men's attitudes. It's really interesting. And I could go on and on, but the fact is, you're constantly being persuaded. The art of persuasion. And also the art of consensus building. You don't even know it. It's happening to you, to your opinions just happens to jive with those around you. And most of you won't be able to really go into any serious debate as to how it happened. It's quite perfect, that, isn't it? Now, it also brings me to Karl Rove. And I remember at the time where Karl Rove talked about reality. And he's a political consultant, remember. And he was in George W. Bush's group, and he was a senior advisor and chief political strategist. And this guy he'd obviously been in the top think tanks and had access to information and so on. And they become terribly, terribly arrogant in a sense to those lesser beings around them when they're making history, as they say. And those around them are just following them making the history and taking, again, the superficial propaganda that's presented to the people. They have no respect for you because it's just too easy to get you to prattle on the same stuff that they want you to believe. You know? But he's well known for many, many different quotes, and some of them rather foul, actually. But this one here is the empire. And it says that there's an aide. An aide said that guys like me were in what we call the reality-based community, which he defined as people who believe that solutions emerge from your judicious study of discernible reality. And this report says, I nodded and murmured something about enlightenment principles and empiricism. He cut me off. That's not the way the world really works anymore, he continued. We are an empire now. And when we act, we create our own reality. And while you're studying that reality judiciously as you will, we'll act again, creating other new realities which you can study too. And that's just how things will sort out. We're history's actors. And you, all of you, will be left to just study what we do. Now, a little concise paragraph there of truth. Because he's talking about they just constantly spin propaganda. Even when they want to, the following day, they'll spin the opposite propaganda, opposite meaning, that forms a form of cognitive dissonance, you understand, which people start questioning themselves for not understanding it. They think there's something wrong with it. I don't understand it. I'll just forget it, and that's what you do. It's a clever little technique. Think back to 9/11, for instance, and the stories that came out immediately on the same day. I think it was either Kissinger or Brzezinski said immediately that day that it was bin Laden who was behind it. The dust was still coming down when they said it. They just knew, you see. And remember that the Peanut Group and all of the members, again, of the Peanut Group, many of whom are also members of Trilateral Group, had written the Project for New American Century about the countries that they wanted taken out in the Middle East and elsewhere. And they said they'd need a Pearl Harbor event to motivate the public support behind these wars. Well, they got it. Just, they're lucky, you see. These guys literally must pick the lotto tickets, winners all the time with the right numbers. Just luck, you see. But anyway, they already had troops ready to go into Afghanistan, which went underway. Boom, away they went. And then before you knew it, just like Orwell said, they said the gun sights just changed subtly, very subtly. And I even read the articles on the air at the time from the Canadian papers that said that we're doing a survey, some survey of news influence, and how cleverly and effortlessly the Americans had started to believe that Iraq was behind it, even though no one actually said it. And they had all these innuendos, etc., even from President Bush at the time. And then during the inquiry, after it was all over and they destroyed Iraq, he said in the inquiry, he said, well, at the hearing, he says, oh, I didn't say. It says that Saddam Hussein was behind 9/11. In fact, it had nothing to do with it, really. But he said he was a bad man and the world's better off without him. That was the lawful excuse to wipe out a country in the Stone Age. And even the articles that were out at the time from the big players, Brzezinski, Kissinger, and so on, about Iraq, and one of them actually wanted all these countries on the Peanut Group to be knocked into the Stone Age, so they could never unite again as nations, and they'd be easily controlled, and they could basically take the oil, etc., which they, of course they did. But facts don't really matter when it comes to the people. And getting back to this one here, do you remember again the that little documentaries, news clips about the soldiers in Iraq cussing at the Arabs over there who didn't want democracy because it was Iraqi freedom, remember. We didn't invade them. We went in to bring them freedom. Don't see it this way. See it this way. Eh? Yeah. So soldiers going in with weaponry and all the rest of it and blowing things up and shooting folk are just there to make them free. And you saw, because it was such a, again, the people who get the most simplistic propaganda are always the troops. It's simpler the better. If you make it more complicated, they'll just switch off. Make it simple, and they'll stick with it. This is my experience. This is what they've found over many, many, many studies. So what they do is they create reality for the public. They always do. And there's one that I said, talking about it, because it's a lot of them are pretty arrogant, you know. Again, the aides said that guys like me were in what we call the reality-based community, which he defined as people who believe that solutions emerge from your judicious study of discernible reality. I nodded and murmured something about enlightenment principles and empiricism. He cut me off. That's not the way the world really works anymore. He continued, we are an empire now, and when we act, we create our own reality. And it's true, they did surveys when they suddenly changed by using the press alone and innuendos. They did surveys to find that most Americans then had become to think within a space of 1 month after invading Afghanistan and so on, that Iraq was behind it, all through innuendos. And here's one of the guys saying, and when you're studying that reality, judiciously as you will, we'll act again, creating other new realities which you can study too. And that's just how things will sort out. We are history's actors, and you, as all the press, all of you, will be left to just study what we do. And I think they had that in Susskind, Ron Susskind, Faith, Certainty in the Presidency of George W. Bush, New York Times Magazine. And Mark Denner is his words in a time of war on rhetoric, truth, and power. So this is how things really are, and they're even better as the time goes on now. Now that the US government even passed laws, they've always used propaganda on their own people. Bernays was a specialist in that. He talked about it often because he was called in and he worked with lots and lots of presidents, quite a few presidents, and to propagandize the people. But it's never stopped. But the US eventually changed the law a few years ago, and I read that too at the time on the air, that they could then legally, because they changed the law, legally allow themselves, which they'd always done anyway, to use propaganda on the American people. Quite something, isn't it? And everyone still prattles on about freedom and liberty, which to me is quite sardonic comedy. We are under so many layers now of the professional reality makers that most folk can never figure their way out. It's all too confusing for them. Now, I want to talk about so many things, and the time is always short. And I really do know today that from own experience, talking to people that I've met here and there, that it's a lot worse than it has been in the past. People now have forgotten, that they forget so quickly, just even 4 or 5 years ago. And they can't comprehend really what's going on anymore. Or else they have switched off, because there's techniques to make people switch off too. Part of it is fear. And they've done so many tests and surveys and focus groups and so on fear motivated turning people's minds off of things. Such as, for instance, here's bad stories in the magazines, and you talk about it with a little group, and eventually they want.
It's like, no, those aren't our people if they sold us. Obviously, they've built an in-group and an out-group. The same way where we would never say a Haitian is the same as a Dominican is the same as a fucking like Ethiopian. there needs to be a distinction in regards to people in America who are descended from slaves in America.
Well, no, yeah, the difference
outside
between
of just
Ethiopian.
African American, because
Hold
that's
on,
just kind of like
the difference.
Right, that would
the
just
difference
destroy America at the end of the
Hold
day.
on, you're over
Because
talking
then other
again.
people will start doing the same thing.
Let the man.
The difference between an Ethiopian, right, and a Jamaican and somebody else is that is their country that they're from. You were born in America. You're American. Get over it.
So Nibbler, again, so this is something that I talked about like many times at this point. I'm gonna have to go in a second, but I'll just for his sake, I'm gonna say this one more time. So we have a legal concept of nationality, right? And in that way,
Yeah,
we are
because they were born.
But this is the thing. You're talking about a particular representation of God. If we're talking about default God as in not unattached, like has no attachment
Default
to
God.
Abraham. Yeah, just a creator.
Mute him. I had him muted beforehand. I was wondering who the fuck you're talking to. Like, I am muted for some reason.
He's
Tyree has
telling me
muted.
not to be. He's like,
Everybody
don't be
mute
so
the
happy,
person
man. It's not
with
that
the
impressive.
opinion.
Tyree
Everybody
has
mute
muted
the
for.
person with the other.
Yeah, people do arm bars like that all the
Mute
time,
the
I guess.
opinion.
Yeah, but that is so funny. He's a retard.
Yeah, the opinion is a
even-
retard. The opinion is a retard.
Yo, Irma, I'm gonna tell you right now, life is fucking going great right now. I met a girl,
You're a
she was
monkey.
fucking doing
You're a monkey.
boom.
Hey,
You have bias.
congrats, man.
I met a
You have a
girl
bias.
in Valentine.
You have a biased monkey.
Say
opinion.
something
Okay.
she gave me.
I don't want to know. I don't want to know. They'll actually say that. I don't want to know. That's too bad to do. If that ever happened, it'd be too frightening. Therefore, they will not look at that particular thing again if it comes up in reality. A little story. That's just how it is. That's what the big bankers know too, at the World Bank and IMF, that had all the countries sign the bail-in agreement, so the next crash that happens, then they simply confiscate the savings of the depositors in the banks. It's all legal now. It's been done in Canada. It's been done. The other term they use is haircuts. That's the bail-ins, because the government claims they're not going to bail them out anymore. But when you really read it all, they're going to get both. They're going to get the government to help bail them out and to take your savings. It's not a bad deal, eh? That's how the world really works. Now, there's so many things you could talk about, but as I say, there's no real point anymore, because folk don't know what's going on. They've already accepted something that's now supposedly normal. That's terrorism. I read the articles years ago too, when after 9/11, and we were told that get used to it, terrorism is going to be here for the rest of your lives and beyond. This is a new norm. It's also the new normal for controlling all of societies. It's also being used for not just the EU to get back on track with Britain, totally immersed in it again, but also to get the whole world